The example problem we're going to perform based on empirical formulas is the following. A compound was analyzed in the lab and found to contain 69.6% manganese and 30.4% oxygen. What is the empirical formula of the compound? So, step number one, we are going to assume a 100-gram sample. If this is the case, we will have 69.6 grams of manganese and 30.4 grams of oxygen. So the next step is to convert each of these quantities in grams over to moles, because when we list a chemical formula, it lists the ratio of moles present. So here we have 69.6 grams of manganese times, if we look on the periodic table, there are 54.94 grams of manganese in 1 mole of manganese. This gives us 1.27 moles of manganese. Next, we take the 30.4 grams of oxygen times 1 mole of oxygen in 16.00 grams of oxygen. This gives us 1.90 moles of oxygen. So now we've determined the number of moles for each element, and we now need to divide by the smallest number of moles. So that's going to be the 1.27. So we're going to divide both of these numbers by 1.27. That gives 1.00 moles of manganese, and that's going to give 1.496 in terms of the moles of oxygen. So the next step will be to multiply by a factor to get whole numbers. If we want whole numbers of each of these, and when you do these particular problems, you're probably going to observe decimals like 0.5, 0.25, 0.333, 0.1666667, numbers like that. So in this case, we have 1.5, which would be 3 halves. So what we need to do is we need to multiply this 1.49 times 2. Okay? When we do that, that's going to give us a whole number factor, or that's going to equal 2.992, which we can just assume is going to be 3. For the manganese, we have to do the same thing. And when we do that, we're going to get 2.00. So now we have each of these, the ratio, whole number ratio, or the smallest whole number ratio, and we can write our empirical formula. So the empirical formula, based on this data that we're given, is going to be Mn2O3. So again, to reiterate, we first express the composition in grams. Okay, we're not given grams here, we're given percentages, so we're going to assume a 100-gram sample. That gives 69.6 grams of manganese and 30.4 grams of oxygen. We now need to determine the number of moles of each of those elements, so we convert grams to moles. That gives us our moles for both the manganese and the oxygen. Then we divide by the smallest number out of those two, in this case the 1.27. That gives us 1 mole of manganese and 1.496 moles of oxygen. We now need to multiply by a factor to get whole numbers. Our whole numbers are going to come out to 2 to 3, and that's going to be the smallest whole number ratio or empirical formula for manganese oxide. So in this case, our empirical formula is going to be Mn2O3. And if you follow this same setup, you'll be really solid for all your empirical formula calculations.